Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Seed World Retail Strategy webinar, where policy meets the real world of the seed business. First, I want to thank our sponsor, CCAN, for their support. We will be doing a question and answer period at the end. Please type your question into the chat box at any time during the webinar. You don't have to wait until the end. If a question comes to your mind, please just type it in at any time. Let us know which of our speakers it is directed to, and we will get to that when we do our little Q&A at the end of the webinar. Our webinar, of course, is being recorded and it will be available soon on our website, seedworld.com/Canada. Now, we have four great speakers today, and I will introduce them in a moment. I just wanted to point out that this is a very timely webinar today. As Parliament prepares to reconvene next month, a pivotal window really is opening up right now for the seed sector, and really the stakes couldn't be higher. We're looking at a sweeping 60-day red tape review to looming federal budget cuts. The next few months are really going to shape the regulatory and funding landscape for public plant breeding, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and really the entire seed system. So today's guests are four very important people involved in these discussions. I am just going to bring them to the stage. Today we have Carla Ventin, who is a government relations professional and owner of Mile 26 Strategy in Ottawa. Doug Miller is executive director of the Canadian Seed Growers Association. Jeff Reid is general manager for CCAN, Canada's largest certified seed supplier. And last but not least is Scott Ross, executive director of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. Scott couldn't be on live today, but I did record a short talk with him that I will play momentarily. Carla and Doug and Jeff, welcome. How are you all today?
Very good, thank you.
Excellent.
Great to see all of you. And again, thank you very much for doing this. But before I chat with you, like I say, I wanted to play a short talk. It's about 7 minutes long with Scott. I thought Scott would be a great person to be on here, not only because I met him at the Canadian Seed Growers Association annual meeting in Victoria, where he was on a panel with you, Jeff, and Carla as well, which was one of the sort of the genesis of this webinar, where I got the idea for this. The Canadian Federation of Agriculture, though, is also one of the signatories to a recent letter that was sent to Ottawa on behalf of the ag industry. This letter was called Let's Grow Canada, staking a claim for agriculture in the government mandate. And as you all know, the letter lays out sort of a national growth plan called calling out, I guess you could say calling out Ottawa's, what the letter says is chronic underinvestment, and making it clear to our elected officials in Ottawa that the clock is ticking. This, of course, has big implications for what we do in the seed sector. And if government fails to invest in foundational research, seed variety development, and breeding infrastructure, the whole value chain from genomics labs to grain bins is going to feel the squeeze. And Canada's seed industry, of course, is one of the most export-oriented, science-driven, and regulatory burdened sectors in the country. So this is a big deal. But we're all going to talk about that shortly. Enough of me talking. I'm going to play my short chat with Scott right now. Again, it's about 7 minutes. So we'll all sit back and hear from Scott. Here we go. Obviously, agriculture contributes more to Canada's GDP than, aerospace, steel, automotive, and yet it's often not recognized at that level. I mean, this is a problem we've struggled with as an industry for years. And what do you think needs to change in how we advocate for agriculture in this current environment that we're in?
I think there's three things I'd speak to there. Like the first and foremost is I think we have made some good inroads in this respect, but as a sector, we need to find a way to speak with one voice on the high level priorities we have as a sector. Agriculture is incredibly diverse. There's always going to be different needs for different regions, subsets of the industry, specific commodities. Um, but we're always challenged, I think, by the reality that farming is very disparate with over 190,000 businesses across the country operating, lots of different organizations advocating on behalf of farmers for their respective constituencies. And so the number one challenge, I think, is just trying to find that through line that unites the sector around what are the major investments and supports needed and really carrying that forward on a consistent basis. And we've made some good progress with the Let's Grow Canada letter that was submitted to the Prime Minister recently, and certainly got some positive attention in that respect. But now I think the onus is on the sector to come in with the granular details that support those high level asks and still try to drive towards some degree of unity there, because I think that's where often the when the rubber hits the road, fragmentation can occur, and we do suffer as a result compared to some of those, I would say, more centralized industries that only have a handful of key players that are able to speak more concertedly with one voice. I think the other one certainly is we need to start looking at food security as a national security issue and really framing that to the government in a way that resonates, because I think there's no question there's a lot of interest on defense right now, resiliency. And there's no question that there's a very clear link between civil unrest and food security. And I think that's no small issue in Canada nor globally. And so, really framing agriculture and investments in agriculture as an investment in national security is a really critical opportunity I think we need to seize, and a reality that I think has been sort of unspoken for far too long. We need to look at agriculture as an investment and not an expense line. And I think at the end of the day, more often than not, we've often been defensive as a sector and looking at what supports are needed or investments are needed to really keep the sector viable and competitive rather than framing it as an investment in the future of our country's economy and building something that is an untapped potential our sector presents for Canada, which is immense natural capital endowment, a highly innovative sector that's demonstrated historically unparalleled productivity growth, and really is that there's an opportunity for us if we make the right investments and the right policy decisions to drive that policy productivity growth back to the kind of rates we saw over the last 4 decades. And I think if we can accomplish that, certainly there's an immense economic opportunity for Canada there, and really driving home that putting funding towards agriculture is not an expense line. It's an investment in the future of our economy, our environment, and even socially for Canada as well, given the strong connection I spoke to already around food security.
Well, this is something we'll be talking about later in the webinar. And I'm just curious as the pressure mounts in terms of the federal budget, and what's your view on the future of like public investment in seed research? What should the balance be between public and private roles? And yeah, how do we navigate that?
Well, it's an interesting moment as we're waiting for this public spending review to really come to a head and start demonstrating where some of the suggested recommendations for areas to rationalize are going to come through. Obviously, there's a pressure on human resources, and I do think in the research space, one area we really need to be focused on is ensuring that we're not losing the pipeline for highly qualified personnel in research to dry up in any way. I think it's a real challenge were we to see human resources in that space dissipate to a place where there's not continuity in a lot of the work that's happening there. And I think what's a long-standing need the sector's had is to make sure that we have a strong pipeline of researchers coming through. But I think more generally, the question around balance, I sort of would reject the premise of balancing public and private as the question. I think to me, it's what we really need right now is a very tactical discussion around who is doing what and who should be doing what in Canadian agricultural research. And so it's not so much as striking the right balance, but identifying where there's expertise, where there's capacity that should fall within the private sector versus the public sector, and making sure we are serving the entirety of our industry in that. There's a lot of small acreage crops that struggle to really get the sort of private return that would incite or incentivize investment from the private sector. So making sure the public sector is present and active in those places. And then similarly, looking at the continuum from basic discovery research to commercialization, and not looking at it as one player versus the other, but where are there opportunities for, let's say, the public sector to continue investing in that basic discovery research that allows the private sector to move forward with regionally appropriate varieties and the like. So to me, I think there's a real risk here, though, that if we don't have that really focused conversation on the research landscape in plant breeding in Canada, that we are going to see some collateral damage or the baby being thrown out with the bathwater unintentionally here. And so I think the overriding message I would really want to leave with people is we need to be calling for a very focused conversation on that before any decisions are made about plant breeding research, because I think some of these things can be unwound very easily, but are very hard to rebuild if they're gone. So I just would call for caution here and the need to really explore with some nuance who's doing what and who should be doing what to use build a better system, potentially with the same amount of resources altogether there, but optimizing what we do have available. I mean, I think is an ideal outcome. It's certainly not a space where I think there should be any intention to cut, because I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that investments in plant breeding research have an immense economic output at the back end of them. So again, just going back to that message about investments in the economy, I think public research, if done in a complementary fashion to what the private sector is doing, could bring real returns, not just to agriculture, but to Canada as a whole.
Have a great day.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Carla, again, thank you for doing this. Now, like I said in the beginning, you work with organizations to navigate some of the complexities happening in the policy sphere, and you're actually working with the CSGA right now to do just that. And so I was hoping, Carla, that you could walk us through what the next few months will look like in Ottawa. What are the government's key timelines and priorities, and what do seed growers really need to be aware of?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me here today. Appreciate that. I would just say I'm feeling things are already ramping up to September. I have had several ministers' offices contact me alone today and rescheduling things and making changes to some things that I had underway. So it's going to be a really busy fall. We're already in the end of August, the tail end of summer. September 15th is when we have all of the MPs who are right across the country right now in their ridings come back to Ottawa. So then things start to get really busy starting September 15th, sorry. And the House will sit with a couple breaks until mid-December, December 12th. They could break earlier. What we expect in the next few weeks and in the fall, we do expect the trade negotiations to ramp up. It has been quite quiet on that front in the last few weeks. And we expect quite a bit of caucus meetings and cabinet meetings, etc. And then as well, between this period when we have MPs in Ottawa, we expect the federal budget to be announced. So I would think that, the federal budget will be announced in October because we're going to have Pierre Poilievre back in Parliament saying, why doesn't the federal government put forward their budget right away so we know what their priorities are? And then what I would say as well is it's going to be a very focused and intense period with the government very much focused on their priorities, economy, security, and sovereignty. And some of the big plays that I can talk a little bit more about is really that trade diversification, the red tape review, as you referenced, Mark, which is a really big one, in those nation building projects and really Canada's industrial strategy. So, the Carney government really trying to figure out what are we good at and what do we need. And I would definitely say the seed sector and agriculture fit into that. And this will all be done under that, fiscal restraint umbrella, as you also referenced, Mark.
Yeah. No, there's, like you say, a lot going on right now. It's kind of crunch time at the moment. It's funny how all these things kind of all seem to happen at once. But like you say, geopolitical risk and trade uncertainty seems kind of higher than it's been in a while. And what can we expect, like, going forward on the trade front, and how could this impact Canadian agriculture and seed exports?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot at stake right now, and you referenced this earlier. I was around, working through the CUSMA negotiations back in 2018 on behalf of food manufacturers, and that looked hard back then. it's way harder and more predictable right now. As I mentioned, we expect that more intensity of trade negotiations, whether it's internal, it will happen more intensive with industry, but also the government's hoping to have some of those conversations, obviously going with the US. What's really important for seed growers and canola growers and all of agriculture to keep in mind is that it's basically in 1 year time that the CUSMA, or USMCA, as the US likes to call it, needs to be renegotiated or renewed. We don't know. It's very ambiguous whether it will be renewed or it's going to be a renegotiation exercise. But for me, what that spells for Canadian agriculture is a lot more uncertainty in the next year. So July 1st is that timeline for that renewal to take place. I know just from my conversations with the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. and multiple ministers' offices, is that, there's no immediate reprieve in sight right now. We do not know what the US, or for that matter as well, China, are going to do. And so hence the fact that you see the Canadian government very much focused inward. In the Canadian government, in my quiet conversations as well, they've been very public about this, is that the Canadian government will not accept a bad deal for Canadians. But basically what that means is 1 more year, I see, of uncertainty for Canadian agriculture, which is extremely difficult.
Yeah, well, like you say, like there's a lot going on in Canada and around the world, and like in terms of politics, and we'll talk more specifically about the federal budget and funding for research and plant breeding next. But how does the current political landscape impact, Canadian agriculture and seed growers? I mean, like you say, Pierre Poilievre just won the by-election. He's going to be back in the House of Commons, and so there's been a lot of strange stuff going on lately that maybe we don't see too often. And so I would think all of this sort of plays a role in this situation we're in now, where we're concerned about funding for plant breeding, seed research, etc.
Yeah, Pierre Poilievre, will be coming back to town. He won his by-election. I think what's really important, and is a common theme, Mark, when we speak and with others in the industry, is we have to speak with one voice. And I think the same would go for Pierre Poilievre. And I think that's what Canadians are looking for. But really, that is what we need to do when we are negotiating with giants like the US and China, is speak with that one voice. With the there's a lot of new MPs who've been elected on April 28th, and a lot of the Liberal MPs are from urban ridings. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to inform and engage those urban MPs, for them to really understand what agriculture is and what a farm really looks like in today. And what that looks like and what the potential is. I think that there's a lot of shakeup going on right now with that regulatory modernization, and how they're going to pull it off with some rookie ministers is going to be quite a challenge. A couple things that I would just flag, and I've seen it before, both during the pandemic and under the first Trump administration. My concern for Canadian agriculture is the thickening of the border. You might recall back in June, the Canadian government has border legislation that they wanted to pass. It has not been passed, but when it does pass, it could have unintended consequences for, increased scrutiny of shipments and whatnot across the border. And you could have border officials on the US side acting on their own accord to slow things down. I'm also, concerned and watching on the political landscape here is the Canadian sentiment toward labor. As people are losing their jobs, are Canadian farmers going to be able to bring in the temporary foreign workers that they need? Or is the expectation going to be that somebody loses a job in the auto facility, in an auto plant, and they're going to have to work on a farm? And I mean, it's just, the mismatch is evident. And so I guess there's lots of things there on the political landscape. And so we'll see how things shake up over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you mentioned the importance of speaking with one voice, because in my interview with Scott, which I'll splice in for the recorded version of the webinar so people can see that in its entirety, but Scott mentioned that's one of the points that he hit on is the importance of speaking with one voice. And we will talk about that as the webinar goes on here. But now, specifically about funding for research plant breeding, we keep hearing about government so-called belt tightening. What do you expect to see in the upcoming federal budget? I mean, we're hearing about cost cutting within CFIA or AAFC. I know it was just recently announced Prime Minister Mark Carney told his departments that, they need to do a certain percentage of cost cutting. He expects them to slash a certain percentage of their budgets by the end of the year. What kind of cost cutting could we see, and what should current ag stakeholders be most concerned about right now?
Yeah, so cost cutting, I can tell you, I have lots of friends working in multiple departments across the federal government, and they are going through that process right now. So August 28th, so that's the end of this month, is when the timeline is that each minister needs to report that to the center to say how they're going to find those cost-cutting measures. And really, the Prime Minister's made clear he's looking for kind of like a strategic realignment. And we're going to have more details of that in October. But I will say something about the federal, I think in October. That's my estimate of when I think the federal budget will be announced. But I would just say as well, the federal budget, it's really going to depend on how we negotiated those trade deals with the US and with China. And I can bet that the federal budget will be written up until a couple days before, because no longer do they really have like printed versions as much as they used to in the old days. It's mostly virtual. But as the impact on growers. So I think that's a big thing. So, you have you referenced, the Ag Canada plant breeding. We know that CFIA does mission critical activity that's extremely important for the sector, helping with exports, helping with regulatory modernization. These are the pieces that I think that if stakeholders are quiet, and I would say this about every program or pot of funding, is that I think everything will be under the microscope. So what my recommendation is that if you like Ag Canada's plant breeding program and you think CFIA is helping your sector, then if it works, you tell them, and preferably tell them in writing so that they can show the folks that they report to. And I guess the second thing I would say is now, so you're going to tell them what works, but also can you also help them with cost cutting measures? And so, for example, seed regulatory modernization fits so nicely in there. It helps alleviate some of the burden of CFIA and makes things run more efficiently and effectively. So I think there's an opportunity for the industry as well to help.
I'm glad you brought that up because it speaks to this issue of advocacy. And before I switch over to Doug here, I just want to point out that, this is my opinion, but I think a lot of people feel the same way, that advocacy is changing, right? Like, instead of reacting, we need to be seen as part of the solution. And I know often we think of advocacy as standing up and making your voice heard and protesting maybe, and that's all good, of course, but in this new environment that we're in, I'm curious, what does successful modern advocacy look like, and what can we do to become more active? And again, I'll just reference quickly that Let's Grow Canada letter, where our industry, there's really been this groundswell of, I think there was 30 ag organizations signed that, including CSGA was one, CropLife Canada was another, Canadian Federation of Agriculture. What can we do to become more active than we're currently even being?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good point. Part of the solution, I mean, that's key. I think that what we need to do is to be a partner with the government. I think now more than ever, we need to speak with the united voice. I think that letter was fantastic, but we need to address government and engage with them as partners in how we can move forward, because we're in very uncertain and unprecedented times. Some of the other tips I would say, modern, advocacy and how can we do it right. Everybody's voice matters. And so, we have, I always hear from farmers across the country who have great contacts with their local MP, MLAs, MPPs, or have contacts in the provincial government. Well, reach out to them. because the channel of communication between the provinces and has never been so strong. And these local MPs do come to Ottawa, and they will on September 15th, and they very much echo what their constituents are telling them, because I hear it all the time when I'm here in Ottawa. I would also say that, in conversations with government, be strategic. I would say now is not the time to be completely ambitious and pull a laundry list, but be strategic in what you're looking for, and preferably in something that is either currently working or something that saves the government money. A couple other things I would say, and I would build on that, the Buy Canadian, Made in Canada sentiment right now. We need Canadian seed, and also we all need to eat. We don't all need new cars every couple of years, but we do need food every single day. And the final point that I would say on and the advocacy piece, and what I think that seed growers can do and play an extremely important role, and this is following my conversations with the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., as well as my experience back in 2018, communicate with the farmers in the U.S., communicate with any cross-border opportunities, communicate with them, because Trump will listen to his farmers. Speaking farmer to farmer, producer to producer is going to be extremely important, because the Canadian government can't do it alone.
Yeah, that's true. No, good advice. Thank you, Carla, for your time, and stay on the line. We'll be doing a Q&A shortly, and we'll switch over to Doug. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Doug. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Mark.
Good. Thank you again for joining me today. Now we just heard some wise words from Carla about advocacy, about what we can do as an industry, and now I want to chat with you about. Well, I want to start off with those 3 letters. I've had you on webinars before talking about this, and we're going to talk about it again, but I think it's a little bit different this time around. SRM, Seed Regulatory Modernization. It's been going on for years. Like I say, you and I have talked about it on this platform several times, but I think this time's a bit different because maybe we're seeing a bit of light at the end of the tunnel now with the new CFIA report, its recommendations that were just released. And so in that spirit, I just wanted to start off by asking you now that you've seen the recommendations, people have had time to digest this, what does success look like now when this whole SRM thing is finally completed, and hopefully maybe next year? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, Mark, like all good things, they eventually must come to an end, and SRM is no exception to that rule. With the SRM policy paper now out, it started a whole bunch of calls with key stakeholders. And someone said to me yesterday, Doug, we're just on the footsteps of Canada Gazette 1 after this. Is this going to be the second last time I'm going to hear from you on SRM? And I said, absolutely not. SRM is all about continual improvement, and we're really happy that the CFIA has met this critical milestone in their initiative. Whenever CSJ approached a seed regulatory modernization initiative way back, 5 years ago, it was with a clear vision of what success looked like. It's that success that really was paramount to our CSJ 2.0 business plan that we launched in 2021. It was about a modern seed system that is responsive to the sector's needs, that is sector-led and government-enabled. A lot in there. But whenever I look at the policy recommendations that the CFIA is putting forward, there's a lot of alignment there. When I think about responsive, we're looking at things like incorporation by reference, which is going to make our system a lot more responsive moving forward. Modernization, we look at how we're going to use incorporation by reference to be able to leverage new technologies in the future, like drones and more genetic testing. Great, incorporating latest technology. We're also really hot. There's also a lot of things in there about digitization, looking at how we can digitize imports, how we can digitize seed tags, all great things. And even a sector-led, we see a lot of opportunities in there for strategic delegation of tasks to an organization like CSGA. So at a high level, we're really happy with where the policy positions are landing. But with that same thing, we do see some opportunities for improvement. We heard Carla talk about budget cuts. In the CFIA proposals, we see a CFIA taking on a lot more responsibility. How do we reconcile that with the fact that governments, agencies, departments are being asked to do more with less? So we really think there's more opportunities to go a little bit further on key things like delegating additional tasks to organizations like CSGA, who are trusted partners. We also have some concerns about maybe over-regulating in certain areas. We think that there's definitely opportunities, instead of regulations, to have operational guidance or policies that will be able to accomplish the same task without tying our industry's hands moving forward with regulations. The other thing is about not being able to address a fundamental issue that we think exists and we know exists within our seed system. That's the fact that we don't actually know at the end of the day how much seed we certify in this country. So these are all things that we're going to be working forward through this next consultation. We have a lot of proposals for CFIA to consider how we can address some of these issues. But all in all, I think what we're seeing from CFIA is the foundation of a successful SRM conclusion. But we're also saying through government, through our pre-budget consultation and our red tape submission to government, is that we shouldn't have to wait. If we see strong alignment on some of these non-regulatory issues, that can be addressed through policy, let's get these implemented. Let's start, implementing positive change for our sector today. So yeah, lots of good things in there, but we'll be releasing our full policy paper in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, well, like you mentioned, you're making some recommendations as part of these discussions, making some recommendations to CFIA on what CSGA thinks about CFIA's SRM recommendations, and it's an interesting dynamic because, as Carla was talking about, like, this is an opportunity for us to help government and to come to government and say, hey, here's what we're proposing to make life easier for government as well. Because, like I said earlier, Prime Minister Mark Carney has asked all his departments, hey, you need to please cut your budget by this amount. And so if we as an industry can come forward and say, hey, here's what we're proposing to do, here's how we can help you, then that benefits everyone. And so, like, cutting red tape, I mean, it's a common political promise, but where specifically do you see SRM like reducing burden and cost for seed sector and taxpayers alike?
Yeah, so it is a buzzword for sure, but in this moment, like, regulatory modernization is one of the most effective tools that the government has to be able to unleash the potential of our sector. And so we're actually very fortunate that we are in the middle, if not the tail end, of this SRM process, right? Because we've had discussions, the whole value chain coming together and saying, how does our seed system work and how can we improve it? So we're actually, I think, really well positioned to be able to clearly articulate as a sector what meaningful change looks like. And because we've been talking about it for the last 4.5, 5 years, a lot of industries are just starting that conversation. So I think we're already miles ahead of other groups in terms of, clearly articulating how we can be helpful. When CSJ went through the SRM process as well, we really were able to distill our main positions down to 3 areas where we think we could provide the best value and be the most support to our Canadian seed sector. And that was becoming the main administrator, being able to take on some of that day-to-day work from the CFIA to be able to get the job done more efficiently, and be able to help CFIA, again, do more with less. Launch a digital single window. Again, this is all about streamlining how you bring seed to market, lots of benefits in there. And the third one is as an advisory committee. So again, we're really fortunate that we've been able to have these conversations. And so CSGA, we've been a trusted partner with the government for over 100 years. Our recommendations through SRM are a reflection of that co-regulatory role. And so we really think that we can help government and help our seed sector take that next step. I'll give you one practical example of how something in SRM and one of these 52 policy recommendations is going to change how seed gets to market. It's a very simple one. If you weren't watching, or if you're not, part of this, you'll miss it right away. There's one in there about downgrading seed that has been graded at a higher status. So right now, again, this isn't requiring a regulatory change. This is simply a policy direction. that right now, if I get my seed graded at foundation level, and let's say that someone comes to me tomorrow and says, I want that certified, I right now have to go back to the grader and get that regraded. What we're seeing in SRM is a recommendation saying, hey, no, you don't necessarily need a grader to be able to do this work. You can do that. So what we're doing is stripping away delays. We're stripping away extra costs. We're stripping away missed opportunities. And so again, this is just one little example of many within the SRM policy recommendations about how we can make small but meaningful changes to the people that are out there right now harvesting seed. Eventually they're going to be processing it. It's just like, what can we do to make their lives easier? Again, a lot of the things that we've been proposing through SRM, they don't require regulatory change, and they sure as heck don't require legislative change. So again, we see strong alignment. Let's get to work on implementing these ASAP so we can make some meaningful change in people's lives.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I do want to talk specifically about, the theme of today's webinar. And part of this is, plant breeding, funding for plant breeding, seed research, variety development, et cetera. And so, we often don't talk about the infrastructure behind our regulatory system. And what risks do you see if CFIA labs, and really any public research isn't properly funded?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Carla hit the nail on the head exactly. She said, if there's something that you need or that that is really helping your sector, you let everyone know about it. So whenever I meet with elected officials or senators, one of the first things I talk about, because of our co-regulatory role, is just the value that the people on the front lines of CFIA, either in seed section or in the Ottawa or Saskatoon lab, and what they're doing for our sector. A lot of them are startled. They said, everyone just comes in this door and wants to bash on the CFIA. And I'm saying, no, this is what they're doing for us is mission critical work. And so when we look towards the future, through our pre-budget submission, we went out of our way to be able to say that, CFI seed section, Saskatoon, Ottawa lab, frontline operations support, they're not only critical to SRM implementation, but they're strategic assets for trade, regulatory integrity, and our long-term sector resilience. So whenever you're thinking about throwing the axe around the public service, keep it far away from this, because our sector needs this support to be able to get seed to market and get seed into the country and out of the country. So it's about making sure we have CFIA properly resources. And again, this is all about long-term vision. At CSGA, we're not just thinking about next quarter's results. As a 120-year-old organization, you're thinking about decades. And so when we think about what we need, this core functionality within CFIA is super critical. But again, at the same time, through SRM, we're really trying to right size, government focusing on the roles that only they can deliver. And so we think that this can get us there. And CSJ, through our main administrator, asks, there's a lot of things that we can do to be able to help lessen their load so they can reprioritize their resources to focus on some of these core areas.
Before I switch over to Jeff, as CSGA, you were one of the signatories to the letter to Ottawa, the Let's Grow Canada letter. Yeah. You've also called for, and other organizations have called for as well, a national discussion, consultation on the future direction of public breeding programs. And what should that consultation include, and who do you think absolutely needs to be at that table?
Yeah. So right now we're hearing the federal government talk a lot about nation building projects. And I think about what our public plant breeding infrastructure is in Canada. In my mind, that was one of the original public nation building projects. And so, we've heard a lot from our members and stakeholders about concerns that they have with the current state of public plant breeding and what they're seeing on the ground, because at the end of the day, they really rely on this foundational part of Canadian ag to be able to deliver value. So through an opinion piece through Seed World, thank you very much for publishing that, we were able to kind of start a conversation. Again, this is a conversation that we're not starting. I don't want to paint that picture, and I'm sorry for saying that. This is a conversation that our branches have been having, that our sector has been having. they're cracks. They're cracks that are starting to show. And if we don't start to have a discussion about where we want to go as a country, those cracks will continue and they'll worsen. Farmers, commissions, companies have invested millions of dollars into these programs. And we need to make sure we have a plan for what happens next, because Canadian producers rely on these varieties to be able to grow high yielding crops with the latest agronomic packages on their farms. And right now we don't see a path. We see a kind of a gap if Ag Canada is not there. Not to say that Ag Canada is the only solution there. There is public and there is private. Both have tremendous value. But what we want to really start to do is have a conversation with outside the seed sector about what's happening and ultimately where we can go. This is not a CSJ issue to solve on our own. In fact, this is one that we need to kind of take a similar approach to Let's Grow Canada. And let's talk about public plant breeding and just plant breeding in general as a nation building project, because a lot of the issues that public plant breeding has, private does as well. How do we talk about sustainable funding model moving forward? There's a lot of options on the table, but again, there are some key issues that are cross-cutting, whether you're public or private, that we need to address. And so we're hoping this winter, through our discussions with stakeholders, that we're going to be able to start to get some momentum to start having those larger conversations about where we go next. Because what we've seen from that article that we published is that there's a lot of that message resonated, but there's also a lot of fear about what happens next.
And speaking of nation building, I'm going to quote Leonard Cohen, one of the most famous Canadian poets. He had a song where he said, "There's a crack in everything, but that's how the light gets in." And so I think what he was saying was, anytime you see a crack form, there's an opportunity. And so, like you say, there's many different ways that we can do this. We can structure this. There's public, there's private, there's many opportunities here. And so it's going to be exciting to see what the future holds. So thank you, Doug. Hang on the line. We're going to do our Q&A. I'm just going to bring Jeff to the stage here. So thank you again, Doug. Hi, Jeff. How are you today?
I'm well. Thank you very much, Mark. Great to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you. And like I said at the beginning, you are a general manager for CCAN. You also sit on the board of Seeds Canada. And I just wanted to start by mentioning that, CCAN you have a list of recommendations as well that you are putting forward to CFIA. And, you're calling on government to shift AAFC's focus toward field-ready, regionally tested varieties. And so I'm curious, what is maybe being missed sometimes when we maybe overemphasize discovery science?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think at this point, it's not maybe so much about shifting to field-ready cultivars, but it's about not shifting away from that focus.
Right. Yeah.
And just to kind of reiterate some of the comments of Doug and Carla, I think right now is a really critical time for us in the seed industry, particularly those independent players out there like our CCAN members and many others across Canada, to really be voicing their concern about a potential shift away from field-ready cultivars. And it kind of goes back again to what Doug said about really focusing on those things that only the federal government can do and do well. And with that network of research farms across Canada that was established over 140 years ago, that's something that we just can't replace in the public sector or the private sector. So that's those investments in infrastructure and creating those field-ready cultivars are things that we really need to emphasize how critical those are to Canada. And so as CCAN, we submitted a pre-budget submission as well, and we made it very clear in there that this is really critical infrastructure, critical breeding, and there is so much investment that has been made as a result of that nation building work that's been done in developing those great varieties. So when you look at just ourselves as CCAN, those 600 member companies across Canada, each of those, multi-generational businesses that are highly dependent on that ongoing flow of products, many of which are coming out of AFC.
Yeah, and I'm a bit of a history buff myself, and specifically ancient history. And I was just reading the other day. I had to remind myself that the foundation of any civilization throughout history is its agriculture. And anytime a civilization forms or society forms, that's first thing it brings with it is its agriculture. And so, yeah, it's a great time to be talking about this and reminding ourselves of that. And one of CCAN's concerns, like you mentioned in your budget recommendations, is full privatization of Canada's germplasm resources. And what would that mean, like say for independent companies and farmer choice, if we were to do that?
Yeah. Yeah. So again, just to clarify, our concern is that it not be fully privatized, or that it is just entirely dependent on public sector. We think it really requires a balance of both. And I think a lot of people are probably surprised to learn that as CCAN, we actually license products from more different private developers than we do public. But still, having said that, what we really need is a balance where those two sides can work together. And our concern is that we've seen in the past, for example, in Eastern Canada, where we had a really significant erosion of our public breeding programs, and then those private players that were in cereals, for the most part, left, if they ever did exist. And then we were left with little to no breeding efforts here in Eastern Canada. And so now, in collaboration with producer groups and so on, we've been trying to rebuild those. But boy, that's a long, slow road to rebuild those programs when you're talking about, from startup, maybe 12 or 15 years before your first product's coming out. So it's something we really have to be concerned with maintaining. And, I think a big part of the concern is that in Western Canada, we still have this really strong flow of incredibly good products coming on, but many of those were funded and supported and developed at a place in time where we had more investment in those breeding programs than what we do today. So there's always that lag effect that we really need to be concerned with.
Yeah, well, and like you say, one of the big worries is, access to new varieties. That's always a recurring worry. And so, like, what exactly needs to happen to ensure like transparent and competitive commercialization, but that works for independence as well?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, again, it comes back to, and I think Doug used the term at one point, the foundation, that a lot of these public breeding programs are really the foundation. So, when we're looking for more private sector investment to come in, we got to think about not only what is the value capture mechanism, but where does the basic germplasm come from as a starting point for those programs to build on. And really that's been from our public sector breeding programs. So I think maintaining that foundation, a really strong foundation there, works, obviously to benefit those public programs, but also the privates. And again, when we talk about the potential of moving upstream into germplasm enhancement, we always say, well, look, if you're not focused on actually developing a finished variety that can achieve market share, how valuable is that germplasm? I mean, we've seen all kinds of examples of programs working on germplasm enhancement that actually never sees the light of day.
Now, CCAN is actually, you've proposed made in Canada co-investment breeding model. I'm just curious, like, what would that look like, and why is it critical for, maintaining national breeding capacity?
Yeah, well, we think, in reality, we believe that the money is actually there. When you put together, between the producer groups with their checkoffs, with seed royalties, with the advent, the potential of a VUA, other public sources of funds and so on. I think the money is there. It's just getting everybody aligned in such a way that we can make it happen. So I think a few things need to be solved. That is just, you know, access to infrastructure and maintaining the infrastructure that's necessary. Basically, who's going to do what things are going to be maintained in the public sector, like is that pathology capacity going to remain there, quality testing, so on and so forth in the public sector. And then, so how do we incentivize private, you know, to be successful as well? So things like germplasm access and sharing, what do those arrangements look like that give private sector some access to public germplasm, but also make sure that those things don't get, you know, tied up or sold off in the longer term.
Yeah, lots of discussions to be had yet and things to figure out. But like I mentioned to Doug, you know, as far as SRM is concerned, moving forward, it feels like we're sort of maybe starting to see that little bit of light at the end of the tunnel now. And I think these are maybe the discussions that we can start to have as an industry that, okay, everyone's at the table here. How do we talk about actually putting this into practice and making it happen? So thank you, Jeff, very much for your insights. And we're going to do a little Q&A now. So I'm going to bring Doug and Carla back to the floor. And that might be a good thing to start on, actually, is this idea of having a discussion and speaking with one voice, and like, who needs to be at the table to create a unified industry voice, and what does strategic advocacy look like in that regard? And Carla, I'm gonna pick on you first for this, because this is part of what you do. You help organizations figure this out and how they can go about doing this. And you sort of touched on this a bit at the beginning, but as our industry now moves, as we look forward to, okay, we're going to finish SRM, get all that figured out. Once we do that, then how do we move forward as an industry and collaborate and speak with one voice? I know there's no easy answer, but what's one way we can really do that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think being inclusive is extremely important. I know that I've been in many discussions from all across the agriculture sector and trying to put together what was just recently sent to government, that joint letter. It's extremely difficult. So I think that making sure everyone's included, but then focusing on what you have in common. We need to work together, and not only, as I mentioned, but I really believe this, not only within the agriculture sector, we have to show how we're united, not just to the government to get things done, but also externally to the US, to China and whatnot. And we also have to make sure that, as we move forward, we do not pit ourselves against the auto sector, the steel sector, the copper, pharma, or other sectors of the economy that are being hit or will be hit soon because of the tariff situation. My final thought on this one, there's no easy path forward. But I would just say that, by nature, any large organization, the federal government is certainly included, they are very risk averse. And it is very easy when you speak to somebody and it's like, no, go here, and point to a different direction. And they are even more likely to do that if there is not consensus in what they're doing. Because then it gets sent higher up into the political office. The political office is like, what are you doing? Why are we moving forward with this if the industry doesn't want it? And they will stall because there are more than enough priorities right now for them to be concerned about. So I think that there is, we have to build that momentum and focus on, I think, what will really matter for the seed sector.
Yeah, well, I think it's really a good news story, because, this idea of speaking with one voice, in case anybody's kind of rolling their eyes and thinking, well, we've been talking about that for years, speaking with one voice. Well, that's true. We have been talking about it for a long time, but I feel, this is my opinion, but I feel like it's happening. I mean, with this Grow Canada letter, sort of this groundswell of support, the industry sort of coming together. I think we are speaking with one voice, and that's a good thing. And obviously we have a ways to go yet. We always do. I don't think we ever get to that final point. But Doug, what do you think?
Yeah, just to add to Carla's comment, one time I was in to see a senator, and he said, you guys in agriculture, you guys got to get together. He's like, can you imagine what it would be like if the Windshield Wiper Association came in one day and the Spark Plug Association came in the same day, talking about the future of a car, and they all have different ideas of what a car looks like. And so I think this is why, like, organizations like CFA, why we're a member of. It's being able to speak with that one voice, to be able to have that larger conversation about, where we need to go. And when I look at the seed sector, yes, we have two large seed associations, helping to drive our sector forward. I think when we speak about one voice, it's about identifying those areas of common ground. Look at what happened whenever we released that joint statement on establishing an advisory committee. Lo and behold, it's in the policy recommendations. Great. So when we look at SRM, it's about identifying what are the 3-5 issues where we agree on, and let's drive those home. Because even in this bigger, like, Let's Grow Canada letter, there's things that those organizations do not agree on and have fundamental different views on, but they were able to come together, park the egos at the door, and say what's best for Team Agriculture and what's best for Team Canada. And that's ultimately what they've did. So again, focus on, like Carla said, focus on the priorities, the commonalities, and drive those forward versus pointing out the differences and really starting to fight about those differences. Let's focus on where we're aligned. And I think that's where we're going to see some success.
Jeff, any thoughts? Like I mentioned earlier, you're on the board of Seeds Canada, general manager of CCAN. So, you're involved in a lot of these discussions as well, where you're around that table with many different people. And what do you think?
Yeah, well, and I did want to again compliment CSGA and Seeds Canada on coming together with that advisory body, and I think that's going to be a great step forward. And I know even just as ourselves as CCAN really appreciate the support of CSGA, and I think what's maybe even more critical is that we expand. We in the seed sector are always good at talking to ourselves, but really critical, Doug, I think that you've been building that relationship with CFA and general farm organizations who obviously have far more political clout than what just we do in the seed industry. So I think that's going to be really key to our success going forward is having the farm organizations, farmers themselves express how important seed is and investment in seed innovation going forward.
Yeah, exactly. And that advisory body is going to be very important. And as editor for Seed World, when the first in-person meeting of the advisory body happens, I hope I can be in that room to take pictures, because that's going to be a pivotal moment. Looking forward to it. But again, I'll just remind our audience, if you have a question, just type it in. We had a nice comment actually from Matt. Thank you. Thank you for bringing the benefits of public breeding programs to more eyes. Thank you for that comment, Matt. Blair said, no hot sauce today for Doug. No, sorry, Blair. But in case anybody missed it, Doug and I did a webinar a while back about SRM. And part of it was we ate spicy chicken wings between each question. And so you can go to our website and you can actually find that webinar and give it a watch. That was one of my favorite ones, actually. That was good. But a question about... I have a question about talking about death by 1,000 cuts, that we often hear about death by 1,000 cuts in breeding and research funding, and what practical steps we can take to help build momentum instead of erosion. And maybe I'll go in reverse order this time. And Jeff, what are your thoughts on that? Because, we always hear this, that, when it comes to federal government's approach to public breeding, that they're not just going to cut funding to public breeding all at once overnight, that it'll be sort of this death by 1,000 cuts scenario. And, assuming that that's true, and what can we do, Jeff, to try and nip that in the bud if indeed there's a fear of that happening?
Right. Yeah. And that really is the fear. And in some cases, it's based on the budgetary constraints and realities, as Carla pointed to, going forward. But that's really what we need to be keeping our eye on, is that particularly, if we're looking at a 15% budget cut, okay, is that a few more technicians here or there? how does that culminate and affect the output of these programs going forward? We've seen in recent years that there has been a significant shrinkage in terms of the number of plots and so on that are being conducted. And that is the real issue where we've ourselves as CCAN, and I know some of the producer commissions are embarking on gap analysis to just understand what is it that we need to do in the short term to keep these programs really viable. But more importantly, I think is we got to be thinking bigger picture. What is the long-term Made in Canada strategy and solution here? So because it is happening, I think right now.
Yeah. Doug, what do you think?
I'm going to flip your question on its head, Mark, and I'm going to say, forget death by 1,000 cuts. Instead, we should be focusing on life by 1,000 heals. Jeff talked about like, what is the gaps? Like, what are the short-term victories that we can look at doing to be able to stop the bleeding? There's a lot of things I think that, are maybe short-term things, making sure we keep funding sites going, making sure that, that pathologist that just retired is being replaced. It's about making sure we can do that until we can have this holistic conversation about where we go next. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities to do things differently, building off that strong foundation that we had. We had Jeff talk about that. But I think let's focus on what we can do, these little victories that we can do to be able to stop those 1,000 cuts.
Yeah, and I'll go back to my Leonard Cohen reference from earlier. If there's 1,000 cracks, that's 1,000 opportunities to say, okay, how can we fix this? What can we do to make that work? And Carla, you've worked with people for a long time, and talking about budgets and things, and there's budget cuts, and this is happening, and it's easy, I guess, to get bogged down in this thinking of a death by 1,000 cuts and turning it into this negative scenario. But like Doug says, if we can flip it on its head and say, hey, instead of 1,000 cuts, if we look at this as 1,000 opportunities to actually fix this, that would be really helpful. But, it's like a lot of things easier said than done, I suppose. But, how can we do that?
Well, first of all, I'm a Leonard Cohen fan too, so love the reference there. But yeah, just building on what Jeff and Doug are saying, I think that, there are, there are opportunities. I also think it's really important, as they referenced, is tracking what is being lost. If there is somebody retiring, if this is happening, then make sure that it's being tracked and communicated. I think that's important. And then I would just say that, when we're talking about cuts, everybody thinks it's an expense. And we've had this conversation before and back in Victoria as well at CSGA's conference, is this an expense or an investment? And isn't it interesting? So I think of, when we spend a lot of money on something, there's one thing that comes to mind in particular is it quickly pivots to, it's not an expense, it's an investment. And the reason why is because we let it play out. Think about education. Your kids, if you have kids in their education, oh my gosh, it costs this much, but it's an investment. It's always said in the same breath. And the reason why is because we play it out. If we don't do that, this is what will happen. And so I think it's the same thing, in which it's very important to play it out. If we don't do this, this is the way this is what is going to happen, and this will be the impact.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like I say, it's easy to get bogged down in the negativity, but if we look at it realistically and say, okay, that's what'll happen, we don't want that to happen, then we can move forward. And it's a challenge for sure. But as we all get around this table now and have these discussions, if there's one thing we've proven in this industry, it's that we can figure things out and make things work. And so I think that will continue. Thank you, Carla, Doug, and Jeff. Thank you, Scott, as well. Thank you again, everyone. Again, thank you to our audience for joining us today on your lunch hour. A recording of this will be available soon. Thank you again to our webinar sponsors, CCAN, for their support. Jeff, Doug, Carla, thank you so much. Have a great weekend, everyone. This is Mark Sinkwitz of Seed World signing off. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, folks.